The story begins not in 2017, but in 1995, on Christmas Day. Dean Martin lay dying in his Beverly Hills home. He was 78 years old, his body ravaged by emphysema and lung cancer. His children were gathered around him. His lawyer and longtime friend, a man named David Golden, sat by his bedside handling last-minute affairs. Dean had already made out his will. His estate was substantial, around $30 million, to be divided among his children and grandchildren. Everything was settled. But in those final hours, Dean made one more request. He asked David to bring him a pen and paper. Dean's hands were shaken, and writing was difficult, but he managed to scrawl out some instructions. David read them and looked at Dean in surprise. "Dean, are you sure about this? This is a lot of money." Dean's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sure. Make it happen after I'm gone, not before. He has to think it came from me directly." David nodded, confused but obedient. He folded the paper and put it in his briefcase. Dean Martin died later that day, and David Golden became the executor of a secret mission that wouldn't be revealed for over 2 decades. The instructions were specific. David was to set up a trust fund with $250,000 of Dean's money. The fund would remain untouched until Jerry Lewis needed it, not wanted it, needed it. David was to monitor Jerry's financial situation quietly. When Jerry hit rock bottom, when he was truly desperate, only then was David to deliver the money. And he was to present it as if it came from Dean himself, as if Dean had set it aside specifically for Jerry before he died. David thought Dean was being paranoid. Jerry Lewis was a wealthy man in 1995. He was still working, still performing, still making money. Why would he ever need Dean's charity? But David had promised, so he set up the trust and waited. Years passed. David watched Jerry from a distance. For a while, things seemed fine. Jerry continued working into his 80s. He did voice work, made appearances, wrote books, but then cracks started showing. In 2006, Jerry's wife, Sandy, filed for divorce after 34 years of marriage. The settlement was brutal. Jerry lost a significant portion of his assets. Then came the medical problems. Jerry had been dealing with chronic pain from a fall decades earlier. The painkillers he'd been prescribed became an addiction. The addiction led to more health problems, heart issues, kidney problems, diabetes. The medical bills piled up. By 2010, Jerry was doing telethons and benefit shows not because he wanted to, but because he had to. His financial situation had deteriorated dramatically. His children from his first marriage weren't speaking to him. His second wife was gone. He was alone and struggling, but he was too proud to ask for help. David Golden watched all of this and wondered when the right moment would come. In 2016, Jerry Lewis collapsed during a performance in Sydney, Australia. He was hospitalized for malnutrition and exhaustion. The press reported it as a minor incident, but David, who had sources, learned the truth. Jerry was broke. His accounts were nearly empty. The medical bills from Australia alone had wiped out what little he had left. Jerry came back to Las Vegas and moved into a small apartment. The man who'd once lived in a mansion, who'd hosted lavish parties, who'd been one of the highest-paid performers in history, was living in a 2-bedroom apartment surviving on Social Security and residuals. In early 2017, Jerry was hospitalized again, this time for heart failure. The prognosis wasn't good. The doctors gave him months at best. Jerry lay in that hospital bed knowing he was dying. And the thing that terrified him most wasn't death. It was the burden he'd leave behind. He couldn't afford his own funeral. His estate was worthless. He'd be buried in debt, and his children would be left to clean up the mess. David Golden knew the time had come. He went to his office and opened the file he'd kept sealed for 22 years. Dean Martin's final instructions. He withdrew $250,000 from the trust and had it deposited into a new account. Then he drafted a letter in Dean's style, using phrases and expressions David had heard Dean use countless times over the years. He signed it Dean and had it notarized as coming from Dean Martin's estate. On August 15, 2017, David Golden walked into Jerry Lewis's hospital room. Jerry was awake but weak. He looked at David with confusion. "Do I know you?" "I'm David Golden. I was Dean Martin's attorney and close friend." Jerry's expression changed. A mixture of pain and nostalgia crossed his face, and, "God, I haven't thought about Dean in a long time." "Dean thought about you," David said. "He left something for you." He handed Jerry the envelope. Jerry opened it with shaking hands. He pulled out the check and stared at it for a long moment. Then he read the note. Jerry started crying. Not quiet tears, but deep body-shaken sobs. He read the note again and again, his lips moving silently. David stood respectfully back, giving Jerry space to process. Finally, Jerry looked up. "Dean left this for me?" "Before he died?" "Yes," David said. "He set it aside specifically for you. He told me to wait until you really needed it, and then to make sure you knew it came from him." "Why would he do this?" Jerry asked, his voice broken. "We hadn't spoken in years. We barely talked after 76. Because you were his partner," David said simply, and Dean never forgot his partners. Jerry held the check like it was a sacred object. "This is too much. I can't accept this. You can and you will," David said firmly. Dean was very specific about that. He said you'd try to refuse it, and I was to tell you that partners take care of each other. No matter what happened between you, you were partners. That meant something to Dean. Jerry broke down again. David sat with him for an hour, letting him cry, letting him process. When Jerry finally composed himself, he asked, "Did Dean really say that? About partners taking care of each other?" "Those were his exact words," David confirmed. Jerry looked at the note again. "You know what the last thing I said to Dean was?" David shook his head. "We were at some industry event in the early 90s. I saw him across the room. We'd barely spoken in years. I wanted to go talk to him, but I was afraid. Afraid he didn't want to see me. Afraid I'd say something wrong. So I just waved. And Dean waved back. That was it. A wave. And now this." David smiled. That was Dean. He didn't need big gestures. He just needed to know you were still out there, still his friend. The $250,000 saved Jerry Lewis's final months. He was able to pay his medical bills. He set aside money for his funeral. He made peace with some of his children. He died on August 20th, 2017, 5 days after receiving Dean's gift, knowing that despite everything, he hadn't been forgotten. But the story doesn't end there. Frank Sinatra enters this tale posthumously. Before Frank died in 1998, David Golden had visited him. Frank was 82 years old and fading fast. David told Frank about Dean's instructions regarding Jerry Lewis. Frank was in his study when David explained what Dean had done. Frank listened in silence, his face unreadable. When David finished, Frank sat back in his chair and stared out the window for a long time. Finally, he said, all these years I thought I understood Dean." Frank turned to look at David. Dean was the most complicated man I ever knew. He seemed simple. The laid-back guy, the guy who didn't care. But that was all an act. Dean cared more than any of us. He just showed it differently. David nodded. Frank continued. When Dean walked off my tour in '88, I was furious. I thought he'd abandoned me, abandoned Sammy. But Dean wasn't abandoning us. He was protecting us from having to watch him fall apart. And now, this thing with Jerry. Setting aside money 22 years in advance for a guy he hadn't talked to in decades. Frank's voice cracked. Now I understand Dean Martin. Now I finally get it. He wasn't cool because he didn't care. He was cool because he cared so much that he had to hide it. Because if he showed how much he cared, if he let people see how deeply he felt things, it would have destroyed him. David asked, "Do you want me to tell Jerry about this conversation when the time comes?" Frank thought for a moment. No. Let Jerry think the money came from Dean's generous impulse. Let him die thinking Dean just did it out of kindness. That's what Dean would have wanted. But tell the story after Jerry's gone. Tell people what Dean did. Because people need to know. They need to know that the King of Cool had the biggest heart in Hollywood. After Jerry Lewis died, David Golden waited 6 months. Then he told Dean's daughter, Deanna Martin, the full story. Deanna wept when she heard it. "That's exactly something my father would do," she said. "Take care of someone secretly. Make sure nobody knew. Make it seem effortless when it required so much planning." David then told a select few others. Frank Sinatra's daughter, Nancy, some of Dean's close friends who were still alive. And slowly, carefully, the story began to leak out. In 2018, a journalist named James Kaplan published a book about the Rat Pack that included a chapter on Dean's secret trust for Jerry. The revelation stunned the entertainment world. Here was Dean Martin, the man who seemed to care about nothing, setting aside a fortune to help a former partner he'd barely spoken to in 40 years. Psychologists and cultural critics tried to analyze it. Why would Dean do this? Some said it was guilt over how the Martin and Lewis partnership ended. Others said it was Dean's way of maintaining control, of being the hero even after death. But those who knew Dean understood the real reason. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't about control. It was love. Dean Martin loved Jerry Lewis, not romantically, but with the deep, complicated love that comes from sharing a foxhole. They'd been through hell together. They'd conquered the world together. They'd created something magical together. And even when the magic ended, even when they couldn't be in the same room without pain, that love remained. Dean couldn't fix what was broken between them while he was alive. Pride, stubbornness, hurt feelings, all of it got in the way. But in death, Dean could do what he couldn't do in life. He could take care of his partner. He could make sure Jerry didn't suffer unnecessarily. He could say, in the only way he knew how, "I still love you. I never stopped." Frank Sinatra's words, "Now I understand Dean Martin," became the epithet for Dean's entire life. Dean spent his whole career hiding his true self behind a mask of cool indifference. But the mask was protection. Underneath was a man who felt everything deeply, who loved fiercely, who cared so much that he had to pretend he didn't care at all. The trust fund for Jerry Lewis was just one example. There were others discovered after Dean's death. A trust for the children of Tommy Mitchell, the stuntman Dean had helped on Rio Bravo. Annual donations to struggling performers that Dean had arranged anonymously through his lawyer. Money set aside for Peter Lawford's kids after Peter died broke. Dean Martin had been quietly taking care of people for decades, never taking credit, never publicizing it. Just doing what he thought was right and moving on. That's who Dean Martin really was. Not the drunk character he played on stage, not the cool guy who didn't care about anything, but a deeply caring man who understood that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is help someone without them knowing, without making them feel obligated, without making it about you. Jerry Lewis died believing Dean Martin had thought of him in his final hours. That belief gave Jerry peace. It allowed him to die knowing he'd been loved, and in a way, that was the greatest gift Dean could have given. Not the money, though that helped, but the knowledge that despite everything, despite the 20 years of silence and the hurt feelings and the complicated history, Dean had never stopped being his partner. Partners take care of each other. That's what Dean told David Golden to tell Jerry. And that simple phrase contains everything you need to know about Dean Martin. He was a partner to Frank Sinatra, to Sammy Davis Jr., to Jerry Lewis, to everyone who'd stood beside him in the spotlight and in the shadows. And when his partners needed him, Dean was there, even from beyond the grave.